Dún Laoghaire Harbour on a pleasant Sunday afternoon. Boats bob up and down in the marina. Weekend sailors cast off for a trip across the bay. People enjoying a stroll up and down the pier. But it wasn't always such a pretty picture. Dún Laoghaire, or Kingstown as it was known in colonial days, has a darker history. This is the story of the prison hulk, the Essex, which was once moored in Dún Laoghaire. During her time there, more than 5,000 convicted prisoners were held on board in wretched conditions before transportation to Australia. It was a sad end for a ship which had once been the pride of the United States Navy. Our story begins in 1799 in the New England town of Salem, where private money was raised to build a ship to protect the inhabitants of the fledgling Republic of the United States of America against their former colonial masters and its seemingly invincible Royal Navy. Curtis White from the Maritime Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, takes up the story.
It was built right here in Salem, Massachusetts. At that time, Salem was just in its heyday of trade. So after the American Revolution, and even some of the people involved were involved in the American Revolution, but they were willing to invest in building a ship because they needed a navy. They didn't have a navy after the American Revolution. Things kind of dissolved a bit, but there was a lot of concern, largely, I guess, with the French. There was some posters out there to try to create subscriptions for building the Essex, and the posters said something like the insolent French. This is, I guess, regarding the quasi-war in the late 1790s. And so the people in Salem, again, this was their heyday in shipping. Everything was opened up. We're no longer bound by the triangle trade after the Revolution. And so America is its own country, and it's beginning to set out all over the world. I mean, almost immediately after the American Revolution, the United States is setting out all over the world. The only thing is they don't have really much of a navy to support them. So they're subject to pirates and other governments and so forth that are putting their will on American sailors and American ships. And so the United States decides to do something about that. So the USS Essex, when it's first put into service, is going to help defend American shipping.
How was the money actually raised to build it? You were saying it was built by public subscription?
It was private money, and two of the wealthiest people in town, one of them, Elias Haskett Derby, was probably interested in investing in this ship to defend his shipping. And when you look through the list of subscribers, they range everywhere from people at $50, $100, $200, and Elias Haskett Derby, $10,000. You know, virtually everybody here in Salem, and somehow at that time is supporting the maritime trade. Salem had been a harbor since probably 1620s, 1630s. So, yeah, everybody was involved. And even the Essex, they were collecting wood from all over, and they have all these high money investors, low money investors, but also even the people in the poorhouse here in Salem were picking apart ropes, old tarred ropes, in order to be made into oakum for caulking the ship's seams. So from the wealthiest to the poorest people in Salem and Essex County, everybody was involved. The keel was laid in April, I think it was April 13th, 1799, and it hit the water, the hull, in September 30th of 1799. And it was delivered to the United States Navy in December, on December 17th in 1799.
Good Lord.
And that was fully outfitted, fully rigged. So between April and December, they built this entire ship. Between October and the time it was delivered, they done all kinds of things like beds, mattresses, clothing for people, outfitted it with cannons, cannonball, various kinds of shot, like double-ended shot for twisting around in the rigging to tear enemy riggings down. They got iron shackles and so forth in case they captured prisoners or had prisoners of their own. So it's just an amazing thing that all this stuff kind of came together this is one of the largest ships that Salem had ever produced. And so it was sort of a regional pride to have done this for the Navy.
And then when it was launched, there was a big crowd there, I understand, to see it launched.
I think I read something about 12,000 people may have been there. When everything was ready to go at exactly noon on the date that it was launched, it got completely quiet. And they had slicked down the ways with tallow to make the ship slide a little easier as it was going to the ocean because of going into the water. Because apparently the way that you launched a ship was a subject of pride, and it was meant to be a sort of spectacle, and to have a whole bunch of people sitting at the shore waiting for something to happen, but to have it bound by friction on the waves would be kind of embarrassing for the shipbuilder. So everything went apparently very smoothly, and just the ship just kind of slowly slid into the water. It really creates a sense of American pride. They were kind of trying to define themselves as Americans. You know, if people were harassing them all over the world in the waters, in the oceans and so forth, then Americans needed to gain some source of pride and self-being, self-worth. And I think USS Essex helped to achieve that.
Cormac Louth is a sailor and self-confessed marine buff with a long-standing interest in the Essex and her history. I caught up with him in the busy surroundings of the National Maritime Museum of Ireland.
The original cost of the USS Essex was $139,362 American dollars. The ship was 138 feet 7 inches in length by 37 foot 3.5 inches in width, and she had a displacement of 850 tons, quite a very, very large warship of its day, considering it only had a single gun deck down below the main deck. It could be said that she was at the forefront of naval technology at the time, because there was an enormous amount of natural timber available of the very best quality in America that perhaps you wouldn't have had in Britain or in most of Europe at that stage. And she also incorporated the designs of the very best naval architects of the day from France, who were possibly ahead of the British in ship development. It was a 40-gun frigate, and the unusual features about it were that she was possibly longer and slightly bigger than most of the frigates that would have been in existence in France and Britain at the time. Very, very heavily built, and in fact she was very, very similar to one that's still afloat to this day. That's the USS Constitution, built around the same time and for the same purpose. It was it would have been very fast in the water, capable of about 12 or 13 knots, and virtually able to probably outsail and outfight and outgun anything of a similar size that was around either in France or in Britain, which were the two other great naval powers of the day. Over the next 10 years, perhaps, it patrolled the Mediterranean, flying the American flag during the Napoleonic Wars, when there was a great deal of activity going on in the Mediterranean with the Barbary pirates, which are preying upon American shipping. Now, during the War of 1812, she was refitted and literally went on the rampage against British shipping over the oceans of the world.
From cruising near the southern pole, where wild Antarctic oceans roll, with a gallant crew, a manly soul, heroic Porter came. Then weathering round the stormy cape, and facing death in every shape, which Anson hardly could escape, so say the page of fame.
She started off on the first voyage in 1812 by patrolling around the Caribbean and around Bermuda, and during that time she took 13 British ships as prizes. Prizes then would have been sold off, and some of the money allocated to the captain and the crew, so they were very highly sought after thing at the time. In 1813 then she sailed down across the equator, the first American warship to cross the equator, sailed around Cape Horn and into the Pacific, where the ship did tremendous depredations upon the British whaling fleet.
He made the high Chalesian coast, the Andes half in vapour lost, the Andes topped with snow and frost, eternal winter's reign. Then to the rugged western gale he spread the broad Columbian sail, and Valparaiso thy fair vale received him with his men.
She was captained at the time by Captain Porter. In early 1813, she used to operate out of Valparaiso, which was a neutral port in Chile, and she would go there to refit. This operation went on for about 6 months, praying out of across the Pacific, ranging far and wide, back and forth between places as far away as Hawaii and Chile. Word soon got back to the British naval authorities that this was happening, and very soon they dispatched several vessels to deal with HMS Essex, or rather to USS Essex, as it was known then. In, I think it was November 1813, HMS Phoebe and another small sloop of war encountered the USS Essex sheltering in Valparaiso Harbour and literally blockaded the port. Now, there was a great shortcoming with the armament aboard the USS Essex. For what reason, I just can't imagine. Her armaments were known as carronades. They were a very, very heavy cannon, which were very, very useful in discharging very heavy shot at another vessel when it was alongside. But they didn't have long-range guns such as 12-pounders or 24-pounders that the British ships were armed with. Consequently, in a naval battle, they literally had to close with the enemy to inflict damage upon them. At any rate, the USS Essex decided to make a run for it. In doing so, she probably would have been able to outsail the 2 British warships that were standing by. But as it rounded a headland just outside Valparaiso in very heavy weather, the 4 topmasts carried away and inflicted great damage upon the rigging, and the ship literally became unmanageable. So the 2 British warships closed to their distance and fought the battle of their choice with USS Essex. As a consequence, after about a 6-hour battle, the USS Essex had to strike her colours and surrender. The crew were taken prisoner and the ship was taken as a prize.
Oh, clouded scene, yet must I tell, Columbia's flag indignant fell. To Essex now we bid farewell. She wears the English flag. But Yankees, she has none on board to point the gun or wield a sword, and though commanded by a lord, they'll have no cause to brag.
After the capture of USS Essex, it was subsumed into the Royal Navy and it retained its original name, but became HMS Essex. It never actually fired another shot in anger, and it was used then up to the end of the war as a troop transport and kept what they call in ordinary, literally in storage, because a great many ships, there was no longer any great need for them after the end of the Napoleonic Wars for blockading duties and so forth.
Following the American War of Independence, the British Empire lost their American colony, which, among other things, had served as a place of transportation for prisoners. As a result, prisons in England and Ireland became enormously overcrowded. Fergus Russell, who has a very personal interest in the story of the Essex Hulk, describes the solution found by the authorities to the problem.
The Hulk system had come into being around the time of the end of the American War of Independence, because that's when, at that time, convicts were routinely just put on ships and sent off to the Americas, and that was the end of them. When the war occurred, that wasn't an option. So the prisons began to fill up and become overcrowded. A hulk is basically a ship that has been decommissioned. It's normally an old ship, either a merchant ship or a naval vessel that has finished its useful life, and rather than break them up, the British government decided to use them to house prisoners on rather than building new prisons. And it was an extensive system, the Hulk system. They would take the old ships, they would demast them, they would take off their rudder, they would take out all of the armaments and anything that was salvageable from it. They would build on the deck, they would build a wash house, and down below they built cells. So the prisoners who were on the ship, they were out in the sea, so it was very hard for them to escape because they'd have to dive off the ship and swim, and many people in those days weren't able to swim. So from a security point of view, it was very secure, and also the prisoners, of course, were often in chains, so they couldn't dive into the water and swim. The Essex was actually turned into a hulk in Portsmouth. They built these cells, prison cells, below decks. They then towed it across the Irish Sea into Dunleary Harbour and anchored it there with a permanent mooring anchor. There were two hulks in Ireland. There was the Essex in Dunleary, or Kingstown as it was then called, and there was one called the Surprise, which was anchored in Cove, or Queenstown as it was then known. But in England, mainly in England, they weren't used in Scotland, they were used mainly in England. In every major river and every major estuary, there was many of these hulk ships. There was thousands and thousands of prisoners held on hulks. In England, the British mainland in England, the inmates or the convicts on board who were waiting to be transported were given work to do. So they were taken off the ship every day, and they were used to build mainly roads or harbours or public works, and then they were brought back onto the ship at night and held on the ship. So they had physical work to do, but whereas in Dublin and in Cork, the male prisoners who were on the hulks had no work to do, and this is one of the reasons that it was a very difficult place for particularly young men to be. The female prisoners in Ireland anyway were kept down in the female penitentiary in Cork, and they made all the clothes and the habits for the prisoners, for the convicts. The British government decided to turn New South Wales into a colony, and they sent out the First Fleet, and the vast majority of the First Fleet were convicts that came off the hulks. This became the new place where people were transported to, was New South Wales.
Another reason for the rise in the prison population at the time was due to some of the social reform taking place, where many petty offences, once capital crimes, had their penalty reduced to transportation.
The early 1800s in Ireland and in Britain, there were a great many offences for which you could be hung, capital crimes as they were known. It was on the cards that a great many offences that previously you could have been hung for, the death penalty was done away for that, and they had to substitute some sort of penalty. They substituted the punishment of transportation to Australia principally. And it served a dual purpose. It got rid of a lot of undesirable people, and just as you could be hung for a great many fairly trivial offences, you could be transported to Australia for a considerable period of your life for equally trivial offences. And children, men, women and children were literally transported. It was a sort of ethnic cleansing in a way, because if you read back through the accounts of sentences that were handed down, it literally would have been people who would have been regarded as fairly useless to society, thieves, or people who didn't have much social prospects ahead of them. They got rid of those, and equally they were able to populate the new colony of Australia. There was a great difficulty in accommodating these new transportees, where formerly they would have been just hung and gotten rid of. Now they had to accommodate them. And the existing jails and bridewells that were there in Ireland and in Britain, of course, simply hadn't got sufficient accommodation to take in all of these people who were awaiting transportation. And that was the reason why they introduced prison hulks.
The Essex Hulk soon became a familiar feature in Dún Laoghaire Harbour, as one writer in the Dublin Penny Journal of 1834 noted.
Here the Hulk, a convict ship, the well-trained sentinel slowly pacing its deck, surrounded by other military men. While many a heavy heart beats mournfully below, as memory brings to view scenes never again to be beheld, the mourning parent, the bereaved wife or sorrowing child, and where hope can scarcely picture anything beyond a life of servitude and disgrace in some far distant and unknown region of the globe.
The conditions on the Essex that the prisoners lived in was deplorable. Unlike the Hulk system in England, where the prisoners every day got off the ships and worked in building things like harbours and roads, and then were brought back at night time, the Hulk system in Ireland had no provision to give the prisoners on board any sort of employment. Some of them were used to help maintain the ship, but the vast majority of them just spent the whole day on deck playing cards, and at night time down below it was just a hellhole. There you had a mixture of people like the Dunghill boy, Johnny McQuaid, 17-year-old, an innocent young chap. He was down below in the Hulk with hardened criminals, were murderers, rapists, were forgers, were into all sorts of crime. And down below there was no guards to supervise what was going on. At night time they were all just sent down below, locked in, and they looked after themselves. So the people were half starved. They were supposed to have sufficient rations, but the suppliers of the rations were cheating the system. They were providing food that was rancid and gone off instead of good quality food. Instead of getting meat, they were mainly being given bones. The whole system of preparing the food was absolutely unhygienic, and everything was served in bowls that were washed in cold water. Disease and sickness was rampant and rife down below. The mortality rates were very, very high, much higher in Ireland than in the Hulk system in Ireland than in Britain or in England. There are many medical reports which state that they were never free of sickness and disease, and that there was constant ill health on board. They were overseen by Dr. Trevor, who was also in charge of Kilmainham Jail. This is the famous doctor, or infamous Dr. Trevor, that was involved in the torture and questioning of many of the heroes of 1798.
An extract from a letter written by the ship's doctor, John Spear, backs up these claims.
We had 249 prisoners on board the Essex. They were never free from both fever and dysentery. During the winter months, they are from necessity obliged to be confined to their prison below, 16 hours out of the 24.
Apart from the appalling physical conditions on board the Hulk, lack of employment, indeed lack of any kind of activity for the prisoners, was also a problem, as observed by the Inspector of Prisons.
A prison service medical officer and an inspector of Her Majesty's prisons, Captain J. Williams, was to write, "There's no means of finding employment on board, none of inciting the prisoners to habits of industry by uniform or routine occupation, none even of fatiguing the body so as to diminish the activity of vicious minds by inducing sleep. No means of classification and separation, the youngest boy associating with the most hardened felon or murderer. There is an attempt at a school on board ship, but it would appear that by far the greater part of a convict's time is passed in recounting his adventures in vice and infamy to his less wicked companions." I think that fairly sums it all up, that they were literally just dumping grounds for the prisoners while they were awaiting transportation. Young and old were just turfed in. There are accounts of the type of cells that were there. The thing had been divided off into little compartmentalised cells that were heavily fortified with great locks. The prisoners were locked down at night time, and perhaps they would have spent anything up to a year in the prison hulks before they would finally have been transported.
In the years that the Essex served as hulk in Dunleary, she housed more than 5,000 convicts awaiting prison ships to take them to serve long sentences in New South Wales. So who were these wretched convicts? Fergus Russell has a particular interest in one of the prisoners. His great-great-grandfather, George Joseph Eastwood, spent the best part of a year on board the Essex Hulk prior to his transportation to Australia.
I was doing family research, and I was particularly interested in my great-great-grandfather, George Joseph Eastwood. He was born in 1810. Born in Ringsend and reared in Ringsend, he was a sailor, and he lived to be a good old age, and he had a very interesting history. There was an interesting story handed down in my family about this man. He had gotten involved in a court case that was historic and important court case, and in the research, by accident, I discovered that a man of the same name had been sent as a convict to Australia from Dublin in 1834. And when I researched a bit further, I found that they were one and the same. In 1834, he stabbed a seaman to death, and the seaman's name was John Higgins. A row ensued between them, and George Joseph Eastwood claimed that John Higgins had insulted one of his female relations. In the newspaper reports at the time and in a coroner's report, it also alludes to the fact that John Higgins had insulted one of his female relations, which must have been his mother, because she had recently died, and the only other known female relation that George Joseph had was a sister who had died almost 20 years prior. In Eustace's pub, George Joseph had been drinking, and he approached John Higgins, and he had words with him. Higgins, who was a much bigger man, picked George Joseph up and threw him into the fire. He walked away, and as he walked away, George Joseph ran after him, drew a knife that was concealed in his coat, and stabbed him in the heart, stabbed John Higgins in the heart, and he fell down dead. I discovered that he had been held on the Essex convict ship for a number of months in 1835, and from there he was sent over to Australia. He was 7 years in Australia convict, but when he got his certificate of freedom, he immediately left Australia and came back to Ireland. That was easier said than you would think, because in those days it was there was a lot of people who would come out on ships to Australia, would desert the ship, and they were always looking for crews to take them back. And he, of course, was willing to go back. Now, the other thing was he was not a typical prisoner in that he wasn't poor, because outside of his work as a sailor, he had some independent means. He owned some property that had been left to him by his father. He came back and got married, and he had 7 sons that survived. And when he came back, he spent his life as a mariner and as a property owner.
Although the vast majority of those who spent time on the Essex Hulk have been long forgotten, some have been immortalised in song.
As Johnny McQuaid 'tis I am known, from old Ardbow in green Tyrone, on a convict ship in chains I am going, for the crime of being a pauper.
I think there are thousands of interesting stories about people who were held on the Essex, and some of them are just people that jumped out for me. One of them was John McQuaid, the 17-year-old homeless person from County Tyrone. He was taken to the court. He was convicted of vagrancy. He was described by the judge as the dunghill boy because he was in such ragged condition, and he was dispatched to Australia for 7 years. In his journey down to Dublin, to Kingstown, he was put inside a cart. The troop of soldiers who took them down were drunk and were constantly beating them, kicking them, and absolutely maltreated them all the way down. From Tyrone to Dublin, they were cruelly treated. And when he got onto the boat, he was stripped and hosed down, and he was his hair was shaven, and he was put down into the hold with these hardened criminals who were about to be transported. He had a most horrible life.
So farewell to Ireland that I adored. I am exiled to a foreign shore. I am damned for the crime of being poor. To 7 years transportation. As Johnny McQuaid, 'tis I am known. From old Ardbow in Green Tyrone, on a convict ship in chains I am going, for the crime of being a pauper.
On the other hand, you had people like Luke Dillon. He was a very wealthy young man, a soldier, who was heir to a fortune, who met a young woman in Dublin, again of a wealthy background, in a case that became notorious and was reported in all of the newspapers the world over. It was the first recorded case of date rape, where he brought this woman to a hotel, he drugged her, he raped her, and he was brought to court and charged with rape. He was found guilty. He was condemned to hang. The family of the young lady involved, Anne Frizzell, from a very wealthy family in Malahide, they did not want the death of this man on their conscience, and they wrote letters asking the authorities to commute the sentence, which they did. He was transported to Australia, but because of his wealthy background and the connections and influence his family had, he never really served in any prison. He was more or less allowed to do as he wished because of his wealth and standing in society. He eventually left Australia. He escaped on a ship. He went to France, where he married and had a number of children before his real identity was discovered. He died in an insane asylum in France, and Anne Frizzell, who was his victim, she died of reportedly a broken heart within 1 year of the incident.
Farewell, lovely Erin, I am now going to leave you. May peace be on your daisy-clad hills, in wild foreign lands. I am bound for to praise you, and I'll sing of your sweet winding rills.
There's a famous traditional Irish song called The Forger's Farewell, and it was researched extensively by John Molden, an academic and singer from the north of Ireland. And I discovered that William Hill had actually been held on the Essex. After he was convicted of forgery, he was brought down for a number of months before he was transported away. He's one of the really interesting characters because we know a lot about how he was convicted and what his crime was, because, as I said, there's this fascinating song that was written contemporary with the time, which celebrates him.
My parents for me welfare, they did their endeavour, as parents they would do for any son. They bound me in my early days to be an engraver, but alas, by that art I'm undone.
The Belfast Forger, it's a well-loved song in the Irish tradition, and many singers have it in their repertoire. And Frank Hart, of course, recorded it. He has one of the finest renditions of the song, and it would be my personal favourite of all of the singers of that song.
And though the cruel oceans between us now do roll, my heart will be as constant as the needle to the pole. A poor convict I'll remain, my sad spirits to condole. Far away from you, my sweet Erin the Green.
The plight of those on board the convict hulks did not go entirely unnoticed. This account is taken from the Christian Examiner and Church of Ireland magazine.
An old, ragged, cadaverous-looking man offered to get me on board for the share of a naggin. I gave him the whole of one, and he brought me down to the boatmen, who charged me double their fare for rowing me out to that water prison, that cage of unclean birds. But when I saw my father in his convict dress, he was no longer my father. In former days, he always kept himself respectably clothed, and even when intoxicated, I always thought I saw something gentlemanly in his appearance. But what a shuddering came over me when I saw him in that loose, bag-like canvas covering. His very countenance was changed. There was something hardened and devilish in it. And when I looked round upon his companions, all clothed in the same garb, masses of ugliness and of evil, some idling, laughing and talking, some swearing furiously as they played at a game of pitch and toss, and others in a corner, busy with a filthy pack of cards, I longed to be on shore again.
Newspaper reports of the time also describe at least one attempt to escape from the Essex by setting fire to the ship.
The prisoners on board, many of them were determined not to be transported to Australia, and they concocted a plan. So what they did for a number of months, they gathered any bits of inflammable material they could find, and they secreted it down below, where the soldiers never went down below. At a given time, I think when they saw or knew that the convict ship was arriving, they then brought all this material up and they set fire to the ship. And the ship went into an inferno. Remember, this is old wood, and it's got pitch, and it's got all sorts of chemicals added to preserve it that are easily flammable. And there was panic ensued. The prisoners began to demand it to be taken off the ship. The soldiers on board were panicking, they didn't know what to do. And for a moment it looked like that the whole hulk would be lost. By coincidence, the British Army regiment that was serving in Ireland was being relieved by a different regiment. So there was a huge number of ships within Dunleary or Kingstown Harbour, and a number of quick-thinking officers decided to help out. They rowed some boats over, they brought over extra soldiers to supervise the guards, and they managed to get the fires out. Nobody was lost or drowned. All the prisoners were transferred onto the convict ship that had come to take them away, and the Essex was repaired.
All of these harrowing events took place in the quiet waters of what we now know as Dún Laoghaire Harbour, and under the gaze of its respectable citizens. But the public mood was at last shifting, and the inhumane conditions on board the prison hulks was giving way to much disquiet.
So the solution of using New South Wales as a colony worked for a number of years. But there came a stage where people began to feel that many of the crimes were being committed, so people would get sent out. If you were a poverty-stricken pauper in Ireland or in Britain and you decided to commit a crime that would get you transported, you'd get transported for 7 years. But when you were out in Australia, if you behaved yourself, you were gainfully employed, you could get work, there was a very benign climate, the person you were assigned to had responsibilities to feed you and to clothe you, etc. So your life could be a lot better if you were transported to Australia than in some of the worst conditions in Ireland or in England at the time. So some of the reformers in England were saying that they were saying, on one hand, people were being sent out for very, very small crimes, and that was unjust. Then they were saying other people were committing crimes, so they would be sent, so they would have a better life. They were also saying that crime was endemic in England because of the transportation system. They wanted a harsher regime in the prisons so that people would be less inclined to commit crimes, right? So they knew that the Hulk system was, while it was relatively cheap, it was very difficult to administer. People had no work on board ships, etc. So the idea came that what they needed to do was build proper modern prisons at the time. So they began building prisons like Kilmainham Jail, the modern Kilmainham Jail. And the idea of the hulks and using transportation as a means of sorting out crime in Ireland and Britain went out of favour.
And so what of the Essex Hulk, once the pride of the American Navy?
The Essex remained as a hulk it came in 1824, and it remained here, I think, until 1837, after which it was sold. It probably had degenerated to such an extent then it would have cost too much to do it up, because unless they were continually being fixed and mended and dry docked and what have you, wooden ships tended to deteriorate greatly, and they needed a great deal of maintenance. There wouldn't have been a great priority with maintaining a prison hulk the likes of HMS Essex, so consequently it probably would have degenerated to the extent where it would have been fairly rotten, and it was sold for a considerable amount of money, I might add. It would have been a large amount of money at the time, because there would still have been a great deal of very, very valuable timber on board that would have been usable for other purposes. Where it was broken up or where it was disposed of, I don't know. There equally would have been a great deal of copper and brass fixings, great big copper bars that held the keel and the deadwoods together, which would have been a very valuable commodity in its day.
More than 200 years after these events took place, a reminder of Dún Laoghair's darker history was uncovered.
A number of years ago, during the renovation of the harbour at Dún Laoghaire, embedded in one of the piers, they found a very old anchor, very large and very old anchor. And it was of a peculiar type in that it was a mooring anchor. On examination of it, it was decided that this was probably the anchor from the Essex. And it's the last piece of the Essex that we know remains. The anchor has been preserved and is on display on a roundabout in Dún Laoghaire, and it's contemporary with the Essex as a hulk, and is made in the manner that anchors of this size and nature were made in around the 1820s. And so A number of experts would say that the anchor almost surely came from the Essex Hulk.
Readings in this programme were performed by Eamon Hunt. On the capture of the USS frigate Essex and the Dunghill Boy were sung by Fergus Russell. Frank Hart's recording of The Forger's Farewell, or Sweet Air in the Green, was used with kind permission of the Hart family. The programme was presented and produced by Sue Russell and funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.